As we continue now with our study of the Christian in the arts, we recall that historically there have been those in the ancient Greek tradition who have argued for certain standards of objectivity for beauty, such as proportionality, harmony, simplicity, and complexity that I've mentioned briefly. And today we're going to turn our attention now to one of the art forms, and that's to music, and see how some of these principles of aesthetics apply. Anytime I think about the phenomenon of music, I find it almost quickening within me a sense of a mystical response to the profound mystery that's involved in the very making of music. And I think also of the conferences and seminars that we do and have done over the years at Ligonier, where we have people who use American Sign Language to communicate the messages and so on, and the words of the hymns to a group who attend who are deaf. And it's always amazing to me to see their response to the words, to the contents, and the way they use their hands and their shoulders and their facial expressions to communicate with each other in a soundless world. And I thought, what a tremendous, tremendous burden it would be for the human person to lose their ability to hear altogether, because sound plays such an important role in our daily lives. And that every sound that we hear has a pitch to it. And again, I stand in awe at musicians who have what's called perfect pitch, which there aren't many that do. But they can not only tell the sound or the note, the tone of a note on a piano or on a violin or on a trumpet, but I heard of one lady that would say, well, my cat purrs in B flat. And that's true. They can identify the tone that a bird chirps in or a cat purrs in, because there are certain definitive, what they call colors, to each tone that the ear picks up. And just like we look at things visually and we see many, 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 many different shades of red and abundantly number of different shades of blue and green and so on. And we can notice their differences because we see that in visual perception of color, that that exact color is measured mathematically by the number of vibrations of the light wavelength that produces that visual experience of color. Well, the same sort of thing happens with tones that we hear in our ear, that sound waves also vibrate, and there are mathematical precision, mathematical ranges within various sounds that we hear. And certain people have been able to acquire, it's not a natural thing, but have been able to acquire this idea of perfect pitch and be able to identify and recognize a tone when they hear it. But music is not made up of a one tone. Music is made up of all kinds of tones, either played in a sequence, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. We've taken just certain individual tones and put them in a sequence and produce a melody. Or we can take tones, 3, 4, 5 tones or whatever, and play them at the same time and produce a harmony, which may be pleasing or unpleasing to the ear. But again, we hear tones of sounds daily with birds, with the wind as it whistles across the landscape. And the sounds that we hear have a powerful ability to impact the heart and the soul. That is, to affect our moods, to affect our behavioral patterns, and even Plato in the ancient world was very much concerned about the popular music of his time because of the tremendous impact it had, obviously, on the behavior of the young people of Athens. I find that fascinating because when I look back to my own youth, I think about how much of our youth culture was conditioned, if not determined, by the popular music of our day. And we were all, as it were, slaves to the radio shows that played nothing but popular music. We knew all of the disc jockeys, and all of them offered the opportunity for us to call into the radio station and ask a special playing, you know, for my girlfriend Vesta, please play me When I Fall in Love. And so there would come Nat King Cole in the air, and the disc jockey would said, RC, send in this request for you, Vesta, wherever you are. And I would know she'd be listening because we all listened all the time. And one of the great inventions of my adolescence in terms of popular consumption was the portable radio. And to be able to go, we would not go anywhere without carrying those large-handled portable radios with us because we grooved on the music. Now, the music that we grooved on when I was a teenager is considered, you know, funny and ridiculous in the modern genre because we didn't have MTV and we didn't have hard rock and all of that sort of thing that's popular in today's. Mostly what we had in our day were ballads as the features of love songs that were so dominant in popular music. But that created how we interacted with each other, boys and girls, in our adolescence based on the lyrics and the sound of these torch songs and these love songs. And not only that, these songs created an atmosphere and a rhythm by which people were able to dance. And so we not only listened to this music, but we learned a different form or specific form of dancing to go along with that music. And so it's just amazing to me how much impact music can have on individuals. And that impact doesn't stop when we go through adolescence. It continues throughout our entire adult lives. And it begins before we're adolescents. I've watched infants begin to move and simulate a dance pattern as they're listening to different forms of music. And people use music intentionally to create moods. Again, back in the 50s, mood music was a very important element. And so if you wanted to buy the newest LP, you could have music to iron your clothes by, or music to dine by. And you had elevator music. You had music coming into the dentist's office to provide a comforting sound to your ears that would perhaps drown out the terrifying sound of the dentist's drill. But this is not new. From all history, we've seen that people understand music has a powerful influence on people's behavior. Think back to the Old Testament and the explosive temper, the madness that was suffered by King Saul. And yet, in order to calm his spirit, he would bring David in to play music for the king because his music was soothing. You've heard the old saw that music soothes the savage beast. And so music can be used to calm the spirit, to excite the sensuous desires of people, to take care of the snakes in Hamlin, where the Pied Piper, well, that's a myth, of course. And you see snake charmers on television, but then the debate is whether the cobras are moving to the music or to actually to the motions of the snake charmer himself. That's another question. But there is a pattern or a rhythm by which even these lethal animals can be somewhat tamed. Now, I've seen music being used in greenhouses to promote growth of plants, and the argument that even plants are in tune to certain forms of music. I can't verify whether that's something that's really true, but I know that people try it and do it. But if you want to see how music is used to create moods, just pay attention the next time to the movie that you attend. When was the last time you saw a movie that didn't have a soundtrack? I mean, the movie is one thing that's going on, the visual dimension of what you see, but that's enhanced or enforced by the soundtrack that carries the motion picture along. And when the music changes to eerie, mysterious music, you know it's time to watch out because there's something suspenseful and scary that's about to happen, and so on. And so, I mean, I still can't think of, I can't hear the William Tell Overture ever without thinking of the Lone Ranger, you know, because that was the theme song for the Lone Ranger on the radio. So, one of the things that I noticed not too long ago, and this is not enough of a universe to prove a point in all finality, but I've seen 2 interviews of young murderers on death row, 2 different interviews, 2 different guys, both of whom murdered their parents as part of an initiation ritual for a satanic cult. So in order to prove themselves worthy of the cult, they carried out the massacre of their own parents. And in both interviews, these young people were asked how they progressed from their childhood thinking and worldview to this kind of behavior. Now, again, these kids, or young men by this time, who were giving answer to these questions were practicing, if you will, psychoanalysis on themselves, and they were not certified to do that job, but their testimony was remarkably the same. Both of them said that they had a straight line in their experience from their addiction to hardcore pornography to Satanism to murder. They all drew that line. But what I found most fascinating is that they both said that they got turned on to pornography and violence from a previous addiction to heavy metal music. And we're running into that crisis right now with rap music that celebrates the violent and the unrestrained sensuality and so on that has become a national debate that's fierce, where major corporations are using this kind of music to hype their products because they know it has a hearing with a large portion of the population. And if you can get the people to listen to these lyrics, you might move people in the direction of Pepsi away from Coca-Cola. So again, how much influence there is on music remains a matter of conjecture, but that music influences people's behavior, I think, is without dispute. One scene I remember from a movie that illustrated that was Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, but in that particular escapade that Ferris Bueller carried on with his buddies, that they ended up in downtown Chicago, and there was a parade there, and he got up on one of these floats and started leading the singing of Shake It Up Baby, Twist and Shout. And before you know it, the whole city was singing the song and dancing in the streets. And you see these scenes of the policemen who were there to control the crowd. They're twisting on the streets, and then they pan up to the office buildings, and you see people standing at the windows in their offices, and they're singing and twisting and shouting, and even panning in on Ferris Bueller's father, who is an executive in one of these office buildings. He's up there shaking and baking, and not knowing that it's his son down there that's turned the city of Chicago upside down. Well, whether or not whole cities can be moved like that, again, remains questionable. but it depicts this kind of impact on culture and on behavior. Now, when we talk about music, we are talking about something different from noise. There may be a specific tone that a jackhammer emits when it's tearing up the sidewalk, but we don't usually associate it with music. Music is a little bit more sophisticated in that, and here's where we run into these principles of aesthetics that I've talked about already, principles of proportion, harmony, and so on. Now, in music, the basic elements that make up music, as we know it, involve the elements of melody, harmony, rhythm. What else? Anything else? How about timbre? It's pronounced completely different from what you think it would be pronounced. Texture, form, so on. These are the inherent elements of music as we encounter it. Now, timbre has to do with how the sound is influenced by the instrument or the mode in which it's expressed. For example, if you hear the tone of B flat played on the piano, it sounds one way, and it'll be pitched exactly at B flat. Now, if you hear a B flat played by a violin, it's the same note, the same tone, but it sounds different because the timbre of a violin is different from the timbre of a piano. And if you hear that same B flat by an oboe that gives you that deep, open sound, it's the same note, the same tone, different timbre. And so the instruments themselves add to the variations of and the elements that are involved in the music that we hear. Again, a melody is not made by one note. Oh, you can use the same note, but you can have a sequence. The first tune that I learned on the piano was called middle C. And it started off with the index finger of the right hand touching middle C, and you've played the song, and you had to sing along with it. I am playing middle C. And you shift it to the left hand. I can play it well, you see. Now notice that whole song was composed on one note, repeated all the way through. But again, it was a song because there was sequence of tones. And so you did have a melody, even though it was the same tune, and it wasn't a very interesting melody. It was a pretty simple, not only simple, but simplistic melody. Now, music also has, in addition to the melody, and the melody has almost or virtually an infinite number of ways in which you can stack or relate individual tones to each other. There are 12 tones in the scale, and it's not like you only have 12 ways of producing. You take those 12 tones and you can relate them in billions and billions of different ways. That's why there's always new songs, new melodies that are being created every day. Now, in addition to the melodies, there's the harmony. And the harmony is when you have more than one tone played at the same time. We talk about chords or tritones, or we record about chords that are made up of 3 or more notes, or even of chordal fragments that are made up of 2 tones each other. And there is, again, a mathematical relationship between the tones that are used to make up chords. You take a child who goes in and discovers the piano in your living room and wants to be a musician and sits down and starts banging on the piano and hitting several notes at the same time, but you notice immediately that what you're hearing is not music, because all of the principles of proportionality and of intervals that make up proper harmony have been violated, and now that sound is reduced to an irritating noise. It's not yet really what we call music. Harmony has to do basically with a mathematical relationship between the tones that are used simultaneously. Now, after our last lecture, and I pointed out these principles of melody, harmony, rhythm, and so on, one of the people in the studio audience came up to me and he said, you know, what do you say about jazz? Because jazz doesn't have any of those elements. It has no proportionality, it has no harmony, it has no melody, and it has no complexity. And I just smiled, and he said, what's the matter? I said, well, the thing about jazz is that it has all of those things. You just haven't recognized them because the harmonies are different. He said, well, I just thought that jazz was spontaneous. I said, it is spontaneous. In fact, the definition of jazz is improvisation. But there are different ways of improvising music. You can change the rhythm from the way it's written, but it's still an ordered, rational, mathematical rhythm that is used. And you can move off the harmony from which a song was written and create new harmonies that have elements of dissonance and so on. But all of that structure of modern jazz still follows strict mathematical relationships. Now, that doesn't mean that every jazz player understands and can articulate those mathematical intervals. The ones who are classically trained and become jazz musicians, they all know those mathematical relationships of intervals and so on. But the others do it by ear. But they still hear the relationships of those sounds. And those sounds are, as I said, mathematically in harmony. They just sound different from the normal way. And we say one of the things, for example, is that Western music is basically, not always, but basically tertian. That is, Western music is built on tones of thirds, a simple C major chord, C, E, G. It's built, first of all, of a major third, and then on top of that, a minor third. That's the way all the major chords are built. And the same way, if you want to make it a minor chord, then you have a minor third, and on top of that is a major third, and you have your basic chords. That's the way music is made for the most part in the Western world. Whereas in the East, most music is based on the chordal system, on fourths rather than on thirds, but that's beyond our concern here now, only to say that even whether it sounds strange to the ear, because we hear it, and modern jazz will use the chordal system, fourths rather than thirds, and that'll sound strange to your ear, but there still is a mathematical proportion to the harmony, and it's now based on a fourth rather than on a third. It's that simple. And so even in these progressive forms of music, the principles of order and harmony are there. Now, time has run out for this session. I'll talk a little bit more about music in our next session.